Hello again, it's Steve Smith, and this is presentation 14 about exploiting a picture sequence. This is very much a practical pedagogy presentation, which I hope you'll find interesting and useful. Now, if you had a set of pictures like that to work with, let me just show you a whole range of different things you could do here which would allow you to work in the target language and produce a lesson or more than one lesson using all four skills: listening, speaking, reading and writing. You can see here from the sequence here we're talking about a visit to Paris. All these pictures are, by the way, from pixabay.com. And I want to tell you how I would have used that with a class, typically a class who'd done, let's say, 2 or 3 years of the language. I'll use English to demonstrate what I would have done. So to begin with, I would have simply read through and given an account of this, pointing to the pictures just to guide the students for the meaning. So I would have said, I left the house at 9 o'clock in the morning. I went to the station. At the station, I took the train. I took the train at 9:30. I went to Paris. I arrived in Paris at 10:15. When I arrived in Paris, I took a taxi and I went to the Eiffel Tower. I arrived at the Eiffel Tower at 10:30, went up the Eiffel Tower and then came down at 11 o'clock. So I stayed at the top for 30 minutes. Then I went to Notre Dame Cathedral, and so on and so on. So I would have simply worked through and let the students listen to the language, hear the verb chunks repeatedly, bearing in mind that this would have been taught at a stage when they'd already heard all these verbs in context before. So we're not presenting much in the way of new language here. There might be the odd little bit here and there. Now, once we'd done the initial read-through, I'd then get the students to join in with some choral repetition. Now, you could do standard choral repetition, or you could try variations. You could try delayed choral repetition. For example, you say a sentence and then you give them 5 seconds during which they can rehearse their answer in their head. That's really good for building memory, isn't it, by the way? Because if you keep rehearsing something quietly in your head, that's going to potentially leave a stronger memory trace afterwards. You could get all the tricks out of your bag during choral repetition, so you might like to use whispered repetition or repetition on a musical note, for example, or even shouted repetition, whatever you think works for your class. So we'll do some choral repetition. So I left the house at 9 o'clock. I left the house at 9 o'clock, and so on. And then work through some of that sequence, not necessarily all of it. You've got to bear in mind the attention span of the class and so on. Then once they've done some choral repetition and got their lips around some of these sounds and that you're happy that they're repeating pretty accurately, of course when you do the choral repetition I always say make sure you do it well, make sure you're rigorous with it. Then you can go into some of your question answer and similar style drills. So I've talked about this before, so I won't go into this into detail, but we're talking about, for example, saying to them, I left the house at 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock. And they might put their hands up and say, I left the house at 9 o'clock. Did you leave the house at 11 o'clock? No, I left the house at 9 o'clock. Ah, you left the house at 8 o'clock. No, I left the house at 9 o'clock. Okay. Did you take the train, the plane, or your bicycle? I took the train. Great. Everyone repeat, I took the train. I took the train, and so on. Okay, can anyone put all the first 3 pictures together? Have a think about it for a few seconds, and then I'll ask you to put your hands up. And, okay, who can do the first line together? So you can work through your question-answer techniques, your either-or questions, your multiple-choice questions, your yes-no questions, wherever it might be. And even your more testing questions, for example, how did you get to the Eiffel Tower? And some of your students might be able to come back with, I went to the Eiffel Tower by taxi. Then you could re-look at some of these questions again using the correct false statements sort of drill, in which case I would tell them in advance, I'm going to say stuff that's always wrong. I want you to correct it for me. So you would say, I left the house at 10 o'clock. No, I left the house at 9 o'clock. I took a taxi. Sorry, I took a train. No, I took a taxi, and so on. So correcting false sentences is a very easy one to do, which generates more repetitions and more recycling. Of course, at any stage, if you think the class is ready for it, you can move away from your teacher-centered lesson into paired work where one partner, if you like, plays the role of the teacher. In this case, that partner could be saying false sentences for partner B to correct, and then give them 2 minutes playing one role, then get them to swap again. And then you can take away pictures, you can hide pictures to see what they can do from memory, a bit like the same principle as disappearing text, but this time disappearing pictures. If you've got an interactive board, you can sort of use your curtain to take away lines at a time and see where they can put whole lines together. And then if your class has got really good memories, you could even take the bulk of the pictures away and see whether in pairs they could do a sentence each to reconstitute much of the story or even the whole story. And let me tell you, with some really smart classes, they could do that. They could do the whole story. With many classes, limit them to what they can do well, what they can master. I'd also say that this work doesn't all have to happen in one lesson. In fact, there's a lot to be said for doing some of the work in one lesson and then coming back to it in a subsequent lesson or lessons, because we know very well that in the next lesson, if it's 2 or 3 days away, some of the students will have forgotten everything you've done. Some will remember bits and pieces, and so you will need to review and revisit this sort of material. And even if it's repeating precisely the same activities, I wouldn't worry too much about that. If you're confident that some of the class will have forgotten, there is some comfort in repeating and having success at something you've done before. And for those who didn't master it first time, then it's a second go for them to get more exposures to the language and another opportunity for some of that language to go into long-term memory. So we've been working so far principally with listening and with speaking. We haven't really talked about grammar. We've had no great reason to go into English, although you can always check for understanding every now and again just to make sure everyone is on board, that you're definitely talking about past tense, for example, and they've definitely got the verbs that are being used. We can then imagine writing this sequence as a short text, in other words, a transcription of the language that you've been using orally. And then once you've got that text displayed and possibly printed for students, that then gives you all sorts of new opportunities. You can revisit some of your questioning drills if you like, but using the text. Or you can do, for example, this is just one of many examples, disappearing text, where having done some reading aloud work, choral reading, individual reading aloud, paired reading using that text, possibly showing a parallel text in English just to make sure that everything is totally comprehensible. You could then take away sections of the text. So in the next slide they would see a gapped version of the first text, and then you could see how much they could do from memory. And then in a subsequent slide take away a bit more information, and so on. And with an extremely able class, you could even take away most of the text, and they would be able to recreate the story, the bulk of the story for you. You can then do individual pair work challenges based on the text, where one person gives a sentence, another person gives a sentence, and then they keep alternating in that way until someone can't speak, and then they're the loser. That's something I've mentioned before to you. Or you can give them a timed fluency challenge where one partner has to try and keep talking for as long as possible while the other times them. How long can they keep going? So far we've used listening, we've used speaking, and we've used reading. We haven't used writing as yet, but writing always feels to me like the skill that you should go to last. For many students it's the toughest one. And by this stage, once they've seen the text and heard it and pronounced the text and had the text in their heads, then you could then potentially move to some writing exercises. For example, gap fill using sentences or paragraphs from the text. If the class needs support, you could give them options to go in the gaps. If they don't, just leave the gaps for them to fill in. Of course, the type of gap depends on the class. So with your more able classes, you can leave whole chunks out or even whole sentences. Some classes would even cope with simple questions and answers. So you simply give them a series of questions in the target language, and then they answer them. For example, what time did you leave the house? Did you take the train or did you take the bus to Paris? And so on. And you can scaffold that sort of task as well by giving them the beginnings of the answer. So if the question was, for example, what time did you go to Notre Dame? You could then just give them the start of the answer. I went ... and then they could finish it. Or even give gaps in an answer for classes that need it. So you can then potentially, when the class is ready, and this may, with some classes, it could almost be done within one lesson. With other classes, it might take 2 or 3 lessons to get to this point where they can actually write up their account. And with many groups, you'd ask them to play very safe, to recycle the language they've been using. So it wouldn't really be free writing, it's still very much controlled production. With some classes, you might just let them off the leash a bit more and say, okay, well, when I collect the work in, I want it to be nice and accurate, but if you think you can do some other bits and pieces in that account that are also accurate, then there might be some bonus marks for you. I might sort of, it's a chance to give the fastest students a bit of extra motivation, if you like. But on the whole, I would recommend go for accuracy. Not because personally I'm obsessive about accuracy, because ultimately I don't think it's the most important thing. I think communication is more important. But in these relatively early stages with beginners to low intermediates, say the first 3 years of learning, I think students like to have a sense of mastery. And if you give them a free writing task which allows them to write just translated English, which ends up being highly inaccurate, then there's going to be no sense of mastery or pleasure in doing that work. And of course, it's likely simply to lead to Google Translate. Whereas if you have structured it tightly, then you know they're going to reuse the language you've given them. They're not going to resort to an online translator. So we've covered a whole range of activities, and you could no doubt think of some others that would build on that. And then in the future, you could reuse these same pictures, with different tenses, or you could produce similar pictures for a different visit and just give a slight twist to the same sort of lesson. So, I'd say from this type of lesson, key takeaways here would be that you're providing lots of comprehensible target language input. And, if it's a challenge for you to use target language, then I'd suggest that's a nice go-to approach for allowing students to hear lots and also read lots of input. We've seen how it recycles lots of high-frequency verb chunks. And we've also seen, I would suggest, how it exploits the 2 modes of learning, both explicit and implicit. Let me just remind you what I mean by those. Explicit, sort of conscious learning, where there's a focus on form and sound and everything is tightly controlled. And then at the same time, beyond that, we'll have going on the unconscious acquisition, where the brain is registering all this language coming in, and then over a long period gives the brain a chance for this language to become procedural memory, so that eventually some of the students would be able to start to use this language without thinking too much about it. So we're exploiting both implicit and explicit modes, and in a way that gives you the best of both worlds, I would suggest. For those who have any doubts about whether we learn mostly explicitly or implicitly, you could argue that here you're kind of hedging your bets and exploiting both modes. And as we've seen, finally, it allows us to exploit all 4 of the language skills. So thank you very much for listening to that session. A reminder of my book with Gianfranco Conti, where we make some reference to that sort of work, the Language Teacher Toolkit, and where I do the same in my book, Becoming an Outstanding Languages Teacher. Next time, something a little bit more theoretical, but really important, and I'm going to talk a bit about memory. Thanks for tuning in. See you again. Bye.